In the history of humankind, the Holocaust was a dark, dark time.
As their armies advanced across Europe, the Allies found thousands of people imprisoned in camps. They encountered piles of corpses and thousands of skeletal prisoners on the verge of death from malnutrition and disease.
This was their first encounter with the horror of what would come to be known as the Holocaust.
The Nazis murdered men, women, and children in cold blood, and after everything, tried to conceal all the evidence.
This was not an ordinary war. This was supposed to be a war of annihilation. This was a war where the enemy was not to be conquered, but destroyed.
Those who weren't killed immediately after being captured were treated like complete animals, and eventually died from trauma and harsh conditions. Today we reveal one of history's deepest, darkest secrets. And of course, this might be a little disturbing, but let's start from the very beginning, how humanity came to such a dark era. The Holocaust. The Holocaust was the genocide of European Jews during World War II, between 1941 and 1945.
These atrocities were very different from the deaths caused by conventional warfare. A new category of crime had to be recognized to describe the intentional attempt to destroy a people. This crime came to be known as genocide.
It was a horrifying but systematic attempt to wipe out the Jewish population of Europe. Until today, it remains the worst mass murder ever recorded in history. This evil was carried out by the Nazis and those who worked with them during the Second World War, where millions of Jewish men, women, and children were targeted simply because of their religion and heritage. The Nazis viewed Jews as inferior and blamed them for many of Germany's problems, and so they used this as justification for their actions. This campaign of mass murder was not a random or spontaneous event. It was carefully planned and organized, and soon enough, it became one of the central goals of the Nazis' broader vision to reshape the world to align with their twisted beliefs. Their ideology was basically that some groups of people were inferior to others and Jews were their main target. But unfortunately, other groups such as the disabled, Romani people, and political opponents were also victims of their brutality. And how did this all begin? It all started with the Nazis' campaign of persecuting Jewish people, and it began immediately after Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933. And the purpose of this campaign was simple: to isolate Jews from the rest of society.
Everything he'd said pointed towards the ultimate idea that you rid yourself of the Jews physically.
At first, they used laws and policies that discriminated against Jewish people. These laws stripped Jews of their rights and made it harder for them to live normal lives. Alongside this, the Nazis spread hateful propaganda to fuel anti-Semitism amongst non-Jews, who began to create a hostile environment where Jewish people were treated as outsiders. And what was the goal of these actions? It was to force Jewish people into isolation and encourage them to leave Germany altogether. The Nazis believed that if they made life unbearable, Jews would have no choice but to emigrate. However, this plan didn't unfold as smoothly as they had hoped. While some Jewish people were able to leave, many found it difficult to do so. And that's when their nightmares began. By the time it was the late 1930s, the persecution of Jewish people became much worse. What started as restrictions, propaganda, and laws targeting Jewish people quickly grew into something far more dangerous and violent. By the time the Second World War began, this persecution was turning into a systematic campaign of mass murder. It became even worse during the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. This invasion marked a turning point in Nazi policies because the focus now shifted from isolating Jewish people to completely exterminating them. Now, besides the actual German military forces, special units were sent in to carry out these killings. These units, known as Einsatzgruppen, were mobile execution squads made up of Nazi soldiers. They did not act alone, however. In many cases, they were supported by local collaborators, people from the areas that the Nazis occupied, who helped them carry out their horrific tasks. The Einsatzgruppen followed the German army as it moved deeper into Soviet territory, and all they did was target Jewish communities, political opponents, and other so-called enemies of the Nazi regime. In the name of security, the Nazis murdered over 1 million Jewish civilians in the territories they had newly occupied. Alongside the Jews, Tens of thousands of Roma were also targeted and murdered as part of this horrifying campaign. The Nazis saw both groups as threats to their vision of a so-called pure society and wanted to erase them completely. Extermination camps were even built to facilitate this large-scale slaughter, and victims were often transported to these camps in crowded trains, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor and Chełmno in occupied Poland became centers of death where unimaginable atrocities occurred. But the worst of them all is the Auschwitz camp. It was such a terrible place that it earned its place in history. Auschwitz. Auschwitz, which would later become the site of the largest mass murder in human history, did not originally begin as a death camp. Its original purpose was to detain political prisoners, including Polish resistance members and others the Nazis considered threats. In the spring of 1940, it was established as a concentration camp under the leadership of Rudolf Höss. Höss was a captain in the SS, or Schutzstaffel, which was an elite defense organization directly under Adolf Hitler's control. The SS was responsible for carrying out many of Hitler's plans, including the eventual brutal persecution of Jews and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Höss was appointed as the commandant of this new camp, which was located near the southwestern Polish town of Oswiecim. The town had been taken over by the Nazis after Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1913-9, an act that marked the beginning of the Second World War. The Germans then renamed the area Auschwitz, and the camp was set up in the territory that had recently come under Nazi control. However, over time, its function evolved, and it became one of the most infamous sites of mass murder in history. The fact that the camp was located in occupied Poland made it a strategic choice for the Nazis, because that meant that it was accessible by rail and allowed them to transport large numbers of prisoners from across Europe. Prisoners sent to Auschwitz with special notations on their files, such as "Return not desired" or "Do not transfer," were marked for death. These labels were essentially death sentences, indicating that the individuals should be killed after spending a certain amount of time in the camp. This decision to execute prisoners could come from various authorities within the camp, including the commandant, the camp director, or the head of the political department, which was the camp Gestapo. These officials had the power to decide a prisoner's fate without any formal trial or process, and as a matter of fact, Polish prisoners made up a significant number of those executed in Auschwitz. Many were sentenced to death by summary courts operating in the Katowice administrative district or the general government, often for political offenses. These individuals were targeted because of their resistance to Nazi rule or their perceived threat to the regime. However, in the entire Auschwitz camp, there was one place that even the strongest prisoners were terrified of. That place is Block 11. The horrors of Block 11. Many of the prisoners executed in Auschwitz were held in Block 11, and this place was notorious for its brutal conditions. This block served as a punishment area where prisoners faced harsh disciplinary penalties or were detained during so-called investigations. Punishment took place in either regular cells, dark cells, or standing cells. These punishments were usually given to those suspected of sabotage, contacting civilians, trying to escape, helping others escape, or being caught during an escape attempt. Regular cells had small windows that were partially bricked up on the outside, which meant that only very little light could enter. Prisoners in these cells could actually sleep on wooden bunks, but the conditions were still harsh. The dark cells, however, were far worse. These cells had no windows. Instead, there were small vents covered by metal screens with tiny air holes. This made it hard to breathe, especially in warmer weather. Prisoners in the dark cells had to sleep on the bare floor, and the time ranged from a few days to several weeks. Beginning in 1942, however, another form of punishment known as standing cells was introduced. These were even smaller, with each space measuring less than 1 square meter. The only source of air in the standing cells was a tiny opening, just 5 by 5 centimeters in size, which was covered with a metal grill. It was extremely difficult for prisoners to breathe, especially if they were confined with others. Entry into these spaces was equally degrading. Prisoners would have to crawl through a small opening at floor level, which was sealed with bars and a wooden hatch. Each standing cell held about 4 prisoners, and so they were forced to remain tightly packed together throughout the night. And despite the physical and mental toll of these conditions, the prisoners were still expected to work during the day. This treatment in Block 11, however, didn't mean the rest of the prisoners were having a field day. Those ones were often subjected to a really common but humiliating punishment: public flogging. These floggings usually took place during evening roll calls, where the entire camp population was forced to stand and watch. Initially, the floggings were carried out with the prisoner bent over a simple stool, but later a specially designed structure called the goat was introduced just for this purpose. The prisoners' feet were immobilized in a wooden box to prevent movement, their abdomen would be forced down onto the goat, and their arms were stretched forward, rendering them completely defenseless.
I was about to stop. I was getting weaker and weaker.
The punishment was administered either by SS officers or prisoner functionaries who used heavy sticks or bullwhips to deliver the blows. And we hate to break it to you, but however you're imagining it, it was much, much worse. The psychological torment was just as severe as the physical pain. The prisoner being flogged was often forced to count out each blow in German. If they lost track or failed to count correctly, the punishment would start over from the beginning. Officially, the maximum number of blows was supposed to be 25, but in practice, this limit was rarely observed. The actual number of blows depended entirely on the whim of the SS men or prisoner functionaries carrying out the punishment, meaning some prisoners endured far more than the prescribed amount. Now, when it came to the actual execution methods, it was an entirely different ballgame. Execution by shooting. When activities first began in Auschwitz, executions of prisoners were carried out by a firing squad in locations near the camp, specifically at areas where gravel had been extracted. These places, which were referred to as the gravel pits, became the site of many early executions. Prisoners were brought to these pits, lined up and shot by SS soldiers. The gravel pits were somewhat isolated, and so it gave the Nazis all the freedom to carry out these killings away from the view of the general camp population. However, beginning in the fall of 1941, the location for most executions shifted to a more central area within the camp itself. From that time until the fall of 1943, the majority of executions took place in the walled-off yard, located behind Block 11 in the main camp. In this yard, the Nazis constructed a specially designed death wall, which was nothing but a symbol of the brutality inflicted on prisoners. The wall was made of dark materials to absorb the impact of bullets and minimize ricochet, and prisoners were lined up in front of this wall and shot. The condemned prisoners, before facing their execution, were forced to strip naked inside Block 11 on its ground floor. This act alone stripped them of any sense of dignity or humanity before their death. If there were women among the condemned, they were taken to separate rooms to undress. Once disrobed, the women were led into the courtyard first, before the men. The condemned prisoners were then marched in pairs to the infamous death wall in the courtyard of Block 11. They were met by the SS executioner, who approached from behind and shot them in the back of the head with a small caliber rifle. Whoever held this position was so skilled and apt that many times he didn't have to shoot twice. After the executions, other designated prisoners were forced to collect the bodies and pile them onto trucks or carts. These vehicles then transported the corpses to the crematoria, where they were burned to dispose of any evidence of the mass killings. However, these horrendous executions were not limited to the courtyard. These helpless people were murdered anywhere. The gravel pits, the courtyard of Block 11, and inside the crematoria themselves. Many of the victims executed in these locations were never officially entered into the camp's records, and so it was easy to erase their identities, making it impossible to account for the full scale of the atrocities committed.
I had nightmares, of course, for I would say for a couple of months. You know, waking up thinking that I'm still in the camps.
A particularly horrifying event occurred on October 7, 1944, when the SS retaliated against the Sonderkommando prisoners, those forced to handle the bodies of the deceased following a mutiny. In response to the uprising, the SS shot 200 Jewish prisoners, many of whom knew nothing about the so-called mutiny. Now, the exact number of victims who were executed by shooting at Auschwitz remains uncertain because the Nazis made sure to hide evidence. However, estimates suggest that nearly 1,000 prisoners who had been previously held in the cells of Block 11 met their deaths in this way. Execution by hanging. Execution by hanging was a common occurrence at Auschwitz, though it was less frequent compared to the other methods of execution. These hangings were usually public, because Nazis used these executions as a method of asserting control and deterring any acts of resistance or attempts to escape. One of the most infamous instances of hanging took place on July 19, 1943. On this day, 12 prisoners from the group of surveyor labor were hanged as a form of collective punishment, and this was because 3 other prisoners who had been part of the same group escaped. Basically, they were killed for the escape of men who were roaming free, and chances are that they didn't even have the slightest idea about the escape. On December 30, 1944, 5 prisoners were executed in the main camp. These individuals, 3 Austrians and 2 Poles, had participated in an unsuccessful escape attempt 2 months earlier. Another tragic episode occurred on January 6, 1945, when 4 Jewish women were hanged. These courageous women had supplied explosives to Sonderkommando prisoners who used them during their rebellion against the Nazis. Incidents like this went on for a long while, and the final hangings at Auschwitz occurred during the camp's last days, as the Nazi regime finally faced collapse. Execution by starvation. In 1941, the camp authorities introduced starvation as a form of punishment for prisoners, which remains one of the most cruel and inhumane penalties used at Auschwitz. This form of execution was also applied in response to prisoner escapes. When an escape occurred, the SS would retaliate by selecting hostages from the escapees' block or labor detail during roll call. These hostages were then taken to dark cells located in Block 11, where they were confined without any food or sustenance until the escaped prisoner was either recaptured or their fate became known. Tragically, in all the documented cases, the hostages did not survive. They succumbed to starvation and dehydration before any resolution regarding the escapee was reached. One of the most well-known and heroic acts during this period occurred in July 1941. During the selection of hostages, the Franciscan priest Maximilian Kolbe, a prisoner in the camp, volunteered to take the place of another inmate who had been chosen. Even the soldiers were shocked at Kolbe's selfless act, and after almost 2 weeks in the starvation cell, the SS, unable to wait for his natural death, ended his life with a lethal injection of phenol. By 1943, however, the use of execution by starvation had become less common, and eventually the camp authorities abandoned the practice entirely, only to take on a more sinister method: execution by gassing. Before the Holocaust even began and the creation of German concentration camps, the Nazis began testing gas as a way to just kill people, and their first victims were mentally ill patients in Polish hospitals. In 1939, the Nazis started using poison gas to suffocate these patients as part of what they called the euthanasia program. The Nazis used the term euthanasia to make the program sound like it was merciful or humane, but it was not. It was a calculated killing of Germans, including children and adults, whom the Nazis believed were unworthy of life because they had physical or mental disabilities. The Nazis thought these people were a burden to society, so they targeted them for execution. This program was a test run for the larger-scale killings that would come later during the Holocaust. By using poison gas to kill vulnerable people, the Nazis developed methods that they would later use in concentration camps to murder millions. In the early months of 1940, the head of the euthanasia program decided to widen the scope of who would be targeted for execution. The original victims had been mentally ill patients, but now the criteria were expanded to include people who were physically handicapped, elderly, or suffering from chronic illnesses. This meant that even more vulnerable individuals were deemed unworthy of life under the Nazis' twisted ideology. To carry out this systematic killing, 6 gassing centers were established as part of the euthanasia program. These facilities were specifically designed for mass murder and were ruthlessly efficient. The victims were killed using pure, chemically manufactured carbon monoxide gas, which was introduced into sealed chambers. Over time, more than 70,000 people lost their lives in these gassing centers, Most of the victims were defenseless and had no way to escape their fate. Once the victims were inside, a poisonous gas was released into the sealed chambers, killing everyone within minutes. It was perfect for the large-scale extermination the Nazis were planning. Beginning in 1942, the practice of mass executions in gas chambers spread to extermination camps such as Belzec, Treblinka, and Sobibor, all located in German-occupied Poland. At these camps, carbon monoxide gas generated by diesel engines was used as the killing agent. The 6 killing facilities established as part of the Nazis' euthanasia program were specially equipped with gas chambers to carry out their horrifying purpose. Similarly, in the concentration camps, SS men took on the task of escorting men, women, and children who had been selected for death. The victims were led to the gas chambers under the pretense of taking showers or undergoing disinfection. Once inside, the victims were exposed to pure, chemically manufactured carbon monoxide gas, which could kill any human adult in just minutes. Initially, the killings took place in the gas chamber located in Crematorium 1 and in Bunkers 1 and 2, which were makeshift gas chambers adapted just for that purpose. From the spring of 1943, the Nazis expanded their operations and began using the gas chambers in 4 other crematoria. Trucks were used to transport those who were too weak, sick, or old to walk to their fate, while the rest of the victims were forced to march. In 1944, when the number of transports arriving at Auschwitz reached unprecedented levels, the process became even more horrifying. Those assigned to death in the gas chamber of Crematorium 5 were made to disrobe in the open air, as the volume of people exceeded the capacity of the facilities. For those that were just arriving at the camo, they were told that they would first be required to undergo a disinfection process, which involved taking a bath. After the victims undressed, believing they were about to receive a bath, they were herded into the gas chambers, where the doors were sealed. They were then killed with Zyklon B gas, a lethal pesticide that suffocated and killed them. Once the victims had been murdered, Sonderkommando prisoners, who were forced to work for the Nazis, were tasked with dragging the lifeless bodies out of the gas chambers. The SS ordered them to cut off the women's hair, which was often used for various purposes, and remove any metal dental work, such as fillings, as well as any jewelry the victims might have been wearing. The bodies were then disposed of by burning them in pits, on pyres, or in the crematorium furnaces. For a time from the beginning of the killings until September 1942, the corpses were buried in mass graves. However, as the number of victims grew, the SS began to burn the bodies in greater numbers, and from September to November 1942, they were entirely incinerated in furnaces. Any bones that did not burn completely were not discarded, but instead ground into fine powder using pestles. These remains were then scattered in the rivers Soa and Vistula, as well as in nearby ponds. In some cases, the ashes and bone fragments were used as fertilizer in fields, or they were spread as landfill in uneven ground and marshes, erasing the evidence of the atrocities while the bodies of the innocent were erased from history. In the latter half of 1941 and the early months of 1942, the gas chambers were used to execute approximately 2,000 Soviet prisoners of war. In June 1942, the gas chambers were also used to execute 320 prisoners from the penal company. These individuals had been accused of planning a mass escape from the camp, and as a form of reprisal and to discourage future escape attempts, they were sentenced to death and subjected to the same inhumane method of execution. By 1944, after the liquidation of the infamous death wall, the gas chambers were once again utilized for the execution of Polish prisoners. It wasn't until 1945 that many of the chambers were demolished, and in a bid to hide evidence, the Nazis destroyed crematoria 2, 3, 4, 5 before the camp was finally liberated. Thanks for watching. We hope this video has reminded you that the world is a much better place without so much hate and violence. Feel free to like, subscribe, and share this video to help keep the memory of history alive. See you in the next one.